Hello, and welcome to Episode 1 of Scholarly Snippets. I'm your host, Stephen Sorensen. Today, I am joined by a guest who has a bachelor's in history, a master's in social studies. He's a NYS certified social studies teacher, and he's currently teaching. He also runs a podcast called the Other States of America History podcast. Hello, Eric. How are you doing today?
Stephen, I'm doing great. I'm in quarantine here. It's been like week 7 so far.
Ooh.
I'm assuming you're doing the same, right?
Yep. I'm in quarantine as well. We've got until the May 15th until it's lifted, supposedly.
May 15th. Are you in New York?
I'm in Michigan, West
Oh,
Michigan.
you're in Michigan. I'm in New York, so
Cool.
we got the worst of it so far anyway. Did you
Yeah,
give yourself the quarantine haircut?
I heard it's pretty bad there, but no, I was ahead of the trend on that one. I've had the buzzed hair for a while now, so.
I got to get one. My wife has been promising to give me a haircut and hasn't come up yet.
Yep. Cool. So, this is my podcast where I just talk with scholars about how they got interested in history, what were some of the factors and motivations, and why'd you stick with it, and, just sort of kind of getting some background on different people and seeing how diverse it is, the different types of people interested in history. So what originally got you interested in history?
Well, I think I was a really little kid when I first became interested in history. I think probably around 5th grade. I remember seeing a magazine, one of those little magazines they have in the classroom, that are put out by what was that company that would always put out those
The
magazines?
Eyewitness ones with
Something like that. Yeah,
the
I'm
eyeball on
older
it.
than you, so there was,
I'm
we're talking
20.
a different
I'm 24, so I
24.
think,
I'm 33.
so yeah, you got almost a decade on me. I'll be
I think
25
you're
in a couple weeks here, though.
no, I'm a millennial. You're a Generation Z, aren't you?
I don't know.
You're right on the edge.
I think it depends on who you ask. There's a few different numbers that split up the different generations, but
Yeah, we got a kid teaching at my school. He's a Generation Z, and he's 23. I think you're right on the cusp. So you could probably choose to be whatever you want
yeah, right.
on that one.
Yeah, I'll
probably
work that
5th
to my
grade.
advantage.
Well, why not?
So yeah, you were 5th grade. You saw one of those eyewitness books or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, and it showed Mayan pyramids. And in my 5th grade mind, I'm going, what is going on here? How are there pyramids in the Yucatan? Or I wouldn't have known the Yucatan at the time, but I would have generally have known, the area of Central America.
Not
And so
Egypt.
that probably was part of it. And then just when I got old enough to start reading things on my own, because I was never a really good student. But once I was able to have a high enough literacy rate that I was able to just read whatever I wanted, I tend to cling to history. And so I always found it very interesting. It just came natural. And so I ended up becoming a social studies teacher. Not a terribly interesting story.
So you saw some pyramids in a book in 5th grade, and now you're a social studies teacher.
Yeah,
So-
and when I was a teenager, the History Channel was actually good. In the 90s, it was pretty good. Early 2000s, it was still actually really good before it turned into the Ancient Alien Channel. For a while, it was the Hitler Channel. They would just show lots of stuff about Hitler.
I think I
But it
remember
was
that.
still pretty accurate. It was a very good channel for a while. And then sometime after Pawn Stars came around, which is a good show, but it kind of moved them away from history and onto, I don't know what they do now. What would you call it? Infotainment.
I don't know. I like Pawn Stars. I've been actually watching them back again a couple times. They
I
got
like
a lot
it too,
of
but it started
historical
transitioning
items.
them to other stuff.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when you first started pursuing your bachelor's in history, how did you go about choosing a school? Because it's different for everybody. There's a lot of different circumstances that go into getting admitted into a school.
Oh, geez. Well, I ended up going to SUNY Plattsburgh, which is right near the New York-Canadian border. And I did not apply to college until May of my senior year because I was an Eagle Scout. My grades weren't that great, but I had these extracurriculars, and the military was really, every branch was sending me stuff, basically, calling me on the phone, calling my mom. And so I assumed I was going to join the military. And then I had a Vietnam War vet actually took me aside, and he was a big USMC, this is the name of where I was and all this stuff. And then he took me aside one day, and he very quietly was like, "Don't join the military." He said it in a tone I've never heard come out of his mouth. And so it just spooked me. And I said, wow, who is this person? I've never known this person before. And so I applied to college very late, and there was only so many schools still taking applications. So I ended up in SUNY Plattsburgh. So not your traditional route of applying to college, but
Still a valid route nonetheless.
I
So,
applied out of fear.
so when did you originally go into history, or did you ever change your major in college?
I originally jumped right into history as a major, and being a history major, there are times where you go through these existential moments. I'm sure you've done the same thing, right?
Occasionally,
You're 23, so you're
existentialism.
probably still in
It comes
school or
with the
just coming out of school.
generations. Well, I had originally gone for a business degree, and I didn't. At the time, it was just I was, I think, 18 or 19, and I didn't have very clear of a picture of what I really wanted to do as a
Nobody does.
career. Right,
Yeah.
and so I dropped out of that, and I wasn't pursuing anything. But this fall, I'm planning on trying to attend ASU online to get my bachelor's in history, and then work from there to probably pursue a higher degree as well after that. But one thing at a time. So, but yeah, the existentialism, that's definitely, I think, common amongst 20th and 21st century individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're kind of taking the opposite path, because a lot of people I know, they started as history and then they get 2-3 years in where it gets really hard and they go, I'm done with this. I want to make some money. I'm going to business. You're going the other way. You're swimming against the stream there. So
Right. Yeah. Well, I was working, and I had this history project as a hobby, and then I decided that I wanted to have it be more than a hobby, and so I want to maybe work in a library or an archive somewhere, and I think getting a history degree would be good for that. So that's why I'm pursuing it. And I don't think I'll ever change my major. I figure I'm going to get my bachelor's in history, and maybe I'll pursue a master's or a PhD, but also I have other interests as well in physics and astronomy and math. So kind of, just figuring it out as I go, but who knows? It'll be interesting to look back on this tape if I'm around in a couple years, just to see how it all
yeah.
panned out. So,
I mean, you're so young. You have enough time, and I always say this to young people. You're 23. You can make 2 major mistakes in your life and still be where you want to be when you're 40.
did
You know
I
what I
say
mean?
23?
What?
I think I said 24. I'm 24. I'm going to be
You're
25 in
24.
May.
Did you have a birthday between the beginning of this conversation and now?
Did I say 23 or did?
I think you did.
Because did you say 33?
I'm 33.
Yeah, and I said you're almost 10 years older. So,
Maybe you said 24 and I said 33, and now I'm confusing with
so
myself.
this is a good thing to bring up about history. And if you were to go and tell somebody I talked to this 23-year-old today, they'd think you talked to a 23-year-old, but really
Yeah.
it was a misrecorded fact that I'm actually 24. So
Human
history
memory,
can
the way it is.
it can be sketchy, and that's why writing stuff down is so important, is to really get it written in stone, so to say.
And we're in a we're not in an oral culture. We don't value memory, and we don't have these poetic devices to memorize stuff. We're infants compared to the ancient Greeks.
Right.
There's nothing there in terms of memory, especially for me. So
Yeah, I think that you speak for the most part for most people.
yeah,
I haven't
it's a
found
modern
anyone.
dilemma.
It'd be great if we could figure out how to splice in some genes to make us all have photographic memory or something, and then we just remember everything that we've ever seen or heard. It'd be great.
There are some people who claim to have that, and I've heard it can be devastating. Can you imagine if you remember 100% everything that ever happened to you at every moment?
I guess I could try and imagine it, but I don't think I could ever really fully
Oh my goodness.
comprehend
But
it. That'd be
I'm sure
pretty
there's
crazy.
memories you have, or there's definitely memories you're going to have. Sorry to spoil the future here. There's memories you definitely just need to push aside sometimes just to get by in life. And if you're able to just play it back like a tape and have it present in front of you, it must be utterly crippling.
True, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, to continue on, what have been some of your favorite parts in your experience dealing in historical fields?
Well, in terms of topics, where I went to school, there's a lot. It's mostly American or Canadian history. It's rare to find a large collection of professors who cover, the classics, or Chinese history, Far East history, Middle East history. Because in order to become a doctorate in these things, you usually have to learn the language of whatever part of the world you're in.
Right.
So unless you're doing, British history, American history, New World history, you're going to have to learn Greek and Latin. You're going to have to learn Chinese. And so we have a lot of doctorates in this country who are American history because it's focused on them, their lives around them, and they can pretty much stick with English for the most part in order to get all the way up and through. So I've been exposed to a lot of American history, but I'm really interested in a lot of religious history. Yeah, a lot of ancient religious history, comparative religions, and things like that. And music history has been a big thing for me. And I've been able to use that a lot with students to make really boring subjects really interesting.
Yeah, I see you have an array of instruments there behind you.
Yeah, this is the man cave. So we went into quarantine. There's not too many other areas I could have set up this whole thing without the wife wagging her finger at me. So it's not the worst background. I also put up a map. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, I can see that.
That's the only history related thing in my classroom. So it's this map.
Well, I bet some of those guitars have dates inside of them. But it's interesting that you bring that up about the specializations. There's not really like even talking about people with photographic memory trying to remember one person's lifetime to try and cram a ton of different people's lifetimes from different cultures over thousands of years to cram that into a lesson plan. That takes a lot of work to learn about each different culture. And so what happens is, from what I understand, is that most historians, they get into a specialization and they sort of stick in that area. Like you were saying, a lot of American people get into American history and they sort of stick with that. They're not really concerned with the classic Greeks or the Romans or the ancient Chinese or Egyptians. They've found their niche and they're sticking with it.
And that's, if you want to keep pursuing history further and further up the academic ladder, it does narrow and narrow and narrow to the point where, I had a professor in Chinese history who just wrote about the mining, the mining operations of obscure Chinese towns between the years of 1840 and 1870. By the time you do that doctorate, you're writing a book about an extremely narrow subject, which only you might have the expertise in.
Right, yeah.
Which is how some people who have some doctors of history, that's how they make their name, is that they, while getting that doctorate, find something that has never really been treated academically in a large work, and they're the ones to put it out. They're like, boom, here I am.
I think that's a great comment, yeah.
Do you
how
have
that
anything
comes
like
about.
that?
I've sort of been looking into some stuff, and I've got my interests, but I don't want to play all my cards too early in case some greater scholar decides to pick it up and trumps all my work. But yeah, I've been looking into like forgeries and stuff. There's a lot of literature on how faking history goes, how it comes to be, and
I love it.
There's been quite a few people that comment in these scholarly articles about how a really comprehensive approach across all fields of faking and deception, it hasn't been done yet. There's not been a really comprehensive analysis of it. And so I've been sort of looking into that. And honestly, now that I'm thinking back on what I just said, if somebody else does take up and completes that, it frees up my time to look into other stuff. So if you're listening to this and you want to do that, go for it.
Yeah, well, that's still a very large subject. So even if somebody takes a couple slices out of that, there's still some room in there for you to fill in your piece.
Right, and I mean, like, forgery, one thing that I've learned from most of the literature I've read is that it goes back as far as time itself. Like, there's a lot of quotes that are like, as soon as the first artist created his first piece of art, the first forger decided to forge his first forgery and stuff like that. Like,
I was reading about ancient Sumerian cylinder seals and how people, which was basically like a signature that you could put into clay. It worked kind of like a credit card. And now as soon as people had their cylinder seal saying, "My name's Dave," and they put it in the clay, people started forging those cylinder seals. So
right, and those are the things you like roll them across the clay, right?
Yeah, I have a couple actually. I use them with the kids.
Nice, yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, they're fun. It's like a circular stamp, so it would just create a continuous design.
I was just looking at one of the, I think it was a cuneiform tablet, and it's a complaint about the wrong grade of copper being delivered to the guy who had ordered it, and it's kind of like a joke. It's pretty funny. So yeah, to continue, what have been the greatest challenges that you faced in your pursuit of history?
Me personally, because I can get to like interactions with students and things like that. me personally, again, once you get to like year 3 or so in a bachelor's program, it's a lot. You're reading a book basically every 2 days in terms of the amount of stuff that they're trying to put into your head. You're taking 5 courses. They want you to read 5 chapters every night. You're reading a book every 2 days. And then if you're living on campus or other kids who are in school, business majors, a lot of business majors, they're out partying. They have like an hour of work to do a week. I've been in some business classes and I've seen business students negotiate with their professors. Day one economics courses, economics 101, 102, macro, micro. A teacher comes in, says, "All right, guys, you're allowed to miss 3 classes this semester." Kid raises their hand. "Professor, how about 6?" And then the professor goes, 4. Does 4 sound reasonable? When I saw that, my mind was blown. Because history professors, typically what they do is they say, "Here's my standard. You're going to meet my standard or fail the class.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to become engrossed in this subject. You're going to at least pretend to love it, and you're going to meet my standard." And that's admirable in this day and age to say, "You got to meet me here."
From your
perspective,
perspective,
isn't a negotiation.
The history professors are much more strict than the business professors.
Yes, because the business professors, they're in business. They realize, I want more students coming into my class so I can keep my job. And so
True.
3 years into your degree, you're just flowing through these books. You're writing these papers. You're losing your mind. You literally feel like you're time traveling because you're so ensconced in this other time. Meanwhile, your friends who are business majors are out drinking, having a good time. Like I was in a fraternity, and the last 2 years I was in the fraternity, there's almost no evidence I was in the fraternity because I was working. But my screwball friends were out having a good time. And so you get to those moments where you're like, do I want to do this anymore? Do I want to jump ship? And so there were times where I was like, maybe I should just go into accounting or something like that.
Yeah, those are good things to bring up.
Yeah, and also there's the challenge, and this might apply to you, like I wanted to be a social studies teacher. Well, getting a bachelor's degree in history does not qualify you to be a social studies teacher in New York State. You need to have a degree in social studies education, slightly different thing. So you would think as an 18-year-old, well, I get a degree in history, I can teach history. Doesn't work that way. And a similar thing, like if you wanted to be an archivist, well, there are degrees in that. Having a generic history degree does not necessarily qualify you for that kind of a job. So that was another struggle when I realized my just generic history degree is not going to get me a job teaching. I got to go to grad school and take a even bigger program than I ever planned on doing just to qualify for that.
From what I've seen, though, it does look like the bachelor's in history is a stepping stone for quite a few of these other careers. Yeah. So it is important to get, even though it's not the end thing that you have to get.
Yeah. And so I know a lot of history majors who double majored, who did business and history, things like that, which is, if you have the energy to do it.
I'm going to be interviewing someone here soon. They did a double major in history and political sciences.
I've seen a lot of those. Yeah. And is he going to be a lawyer? Or is he planning on being a lawyer?
I don't know, but there are quite a few lawyers that double in history.
Yeah. It's one of the more popular majors that lawyers take up at some level is history, believe it or not, as opposed to political science. Also, I've seen a lot of English majors going to law, which makes sense. I work for a lawyer, and it's a lot of tedious reading, determining what exactly a contract says versus what you think it says or what the title says. Right. I saw it for a while, and I thought about law, and it's so tedious.
So you've got your bachelor's in history. You've got your master's in social studies. Do you have any plans to pursue other degrees, or?
Yeah, I have my master's. It's education, generic education, but it's qualifying me to teach social studies and special ed. I got that too. So that's why it was such a big program. At this point, I'm married. I'm 33. I got a job. If the opportunity presented itself to be in a doctoral program and jump up another level, I would probably take it. But I'm not looking for it right now. I know for a fact I do not have the time to do it. Right, and I know people who've done doctoral programs, and sometimes it can just be all-consuming. It just takes you away. So.
Right. Yeah,
those are
good points to bring up. Yeah. I've been surprised at how busy I've been too, as well, being in quarantine. Well,
have you taken up any new hobbies?
Not really. I mean, other than this, I've just been putting a lot more time into my hobby, my side project of Ctruth. So yeah, I've put a lot more time in this.
What is Ctruth?
So Ctruth is my history project. That's the title I gave it. It originally was called Chronology Truth.
Okay.
It was an attempt of mine to hone in on my own history skills and sort of post up. So I wasn't a scholar and I didn't have much scholarly contact with anybody, and I still wanted to learn stuff about history and then to also have other people check it. And so I was posting it online and sharing it with people to sort of have a layman peer review
Peer review.
type
Yeah.
system,
That's great.
just to get going. And I found that a lot of people, or like more people than I had originally anticipated, they were having trouble with spelling out chronology, and also they didn't know what chronology was. And so for anyone watching this, chronology is the order of events in time, and the study of that order of events. And so to shorten that, I call it Ctruth now. And I think it's sort of a clever shortening too, because it's like see the truth of what's going on and what's happened and whatnot. And so yeah, that's been my project. I started my website I think 2 years ago. So it was actually about a year ago I started the website. It was in January 2019, and I updated the title just this January to Ctruth. And so I've got the website at www.ctruth.today, and I post articles there. I have a Patreon for it, so I do special content for my patrons. There's been a lot of people that have specific topics that they want looked into, and so my one of my patrons, SB Alger, he really wanted to know more about the canonization of the Bible, and so I went in and I wrote an article, sort of a brief summary of how did the different books of the Bible get picked, and
The qualifications.
yeah, like who decided that these books would be in the New Testament, these books would be in the Old, when did the Apocrypha get taken out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I had another patron who was interested in the early Russian Orthodox Church in America, and so I wrote a article to talk about the journey of the Russian Orthodox into Alaska and then down into California and eventually into New York, and that was actually kind of really fun for me to look into, so I enjoyed that. And I've got a bunch of other articles up too for people that have requested them. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Also, I've been looking into this. I don't know. Have you ever looked into Isaac Newton's ancient, or what is it? Something, the chronology of ancient kingdoms amended. Have you ever heard of that?
No, he put together a like a timeline of sorts.
Yeah. So Isaac Newton obviously is extremely famous for his endeavors in the sciences,
Yeah,
but
but he's a polymath.
he's lesser known for his pursuits in the historical realms. And there was a book allegedly authored by him that was published posthumously. And
Allegedly.
yeah, I believe it was by him, but it's alleged by his nephew, I think it was, that took it and published it. So really, it's harder to tell when it's published posthumously. But still, it was a very controversial work. It shortened.
I've never heard of this. Why was it controversial?
It shortened the Greek timeline by 300 years, I think. It moved the Trojan War 300 years closer to us, and it shortened the Egyptian timeline, I think, by 1,000 or 1,200 years. So it moved that closer to us.
Did he do that in order to put it into a biblical timeline to
I-
reconcile?
I do believe that that was influential in his pursuit here, was to try and figure out what had happened, how many years had passed since the creation of the world, maybe, or when things had happened. I'm not really an expert on the book, but I've been translating it from the older English to the newer one to update it so other people can read it easier. And then I've also I spent some time this month or during quarantine translating or updating the English from Dionysius Batavius's History of the World. I don't know if you've ever looked into that.
That one I've heard of.
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty big book in chronology. Scaliger and Batavius both sort of put down the basics that are worked off of today for ancient and really the whole line of history. So yeah, that stuff has been interesting, but like, this podcast is more so for me to talk to other people. I chat about this all the time on my other videos.
Oh, you don't want people to know too much about yourself, do you?
Well, no, I mean, I have this content out, and so I'm sort of repeating myself a little bit and even sharing it here. So, but no,
I'm sorry for being interested in your life.
I like to talk to people, so I don't mind sharing it all. But yeah, also we're going to talk about this here in a bit with you, but also I was interested in pseudo history and pseudoscience and how do we
That's what gets you interested when you're young.
Right. How do we know? How do we know what is pseudo and what is legitimate? And what are some steps that we can take to identify stuff like that? And so that was a pretty big inspiration as well on trying to determine whether something was or wasn't legitimate history. Mm-hmm. So actually, we can just go into that right now. So you told me you're the teacher and that you deal with many students who fall for pseudoscience and pseudo history. How do you deal with that?
Well, one subject, we were talking about ancient forgeries. Modern forgeries are still are incredibly prevalent, especially for these kids when they go on things like Wikipedia and they start quoting things like their facts. I actually made up a guy on Wikipedia, and there's an actual running list of the world record for how long you can keep a hoax going on Wikipedia, and I think the record's 13 years. The thing I got going, which I could tell you privately because I don't want to give it away, I'm on year 10, so I'm going for the record here.
Oh, all right, yeah, and you're not going to share what it is.
No, I'll tell you. I'm just not going to tell everyone who sees this.
Tell me off the air. I won't expose your secret. But yeah,
I've told every single one of my students. So I've never not told somebody I know personally. So everyone knows about it, and they're all keeping the secret. It's a big joke on everybody else.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah, and I invented a guy, and it started in college when we were discussing the turn of the end of the 19th century. You had a bunch of scholars, mostly Orientalists, who believed that Jesus was not a historical figure. They first presented that idea that Jesus was not a real person. There was no even inspiration for the historical person of Jesus. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
A hodgepodge of other myths slammed together. Whereas the historical consensus now is there was a guy who had a name similar to Jesus, you know?
Well, I mean, there's still people today that, in scholarly circles, that don't believe he was a real person.
Yeah, that don't.
The overwhelming majority do believe it, but there's a growing number of people. It's not so much a belief
as just an analysis on the sources we have that, yes, Jesus, there was a person that we now call Jesus, and you could argue if he was the son of God all day, but there was a guy. There was a singular person who all these myths and legends might have collected around. But yeah, around the turn of right before the 20th century, there was a movement to say never existed. No figure ever, there never was one guy. It was just all these myths coalescing, and some sort of Gnostic cult or something came together and invented this person. And so I was discussing in college, well, what would it take to actually invent a person and get away with it? And it's actually a pretty hard thing to do. And in the case of Jesus, I don't see how that would have happened. What?
Is it though?
Well, I mean...
Are you familiar with the story about Edward Stryka?
No, I looked him up.
I don't know if you're going to find anything on it. I've only been able to find one article on it from JSTOR, and basically it was this guy who invented a poet and tricked this, I think, news operator guy to believe that it was a real person, and the whole thing was a hoax to make fun of the person that believed that the guy was real. And eventually, like, the guy who had been duped figured out he had been duped, but he didn't tell anyone else. And
because he didn't want to look stupid.
Right. And so everybody else that had been following this, like, he had quite a following of people that were following this poet, and they all believed he was a real poet who actually existed and didn't misrepresent himself at all. The guy that got duped figured out he was duped and didn't tell anyone else, and so he kept the charade going after he had already figured out that it was a fake person. And eventually he tries to kill the guy off in his publications, and the guy Edward Stryka, he appears in a different magazine saying, no, I'm not dead, I'm still alive, everything's chill. And basically, long story short, at the end of it, the guy got exposed and caught and executed
Oh my! Obviously not in this country.
I think it was communist Russia under the
The
regime.
Soviet Union. Yeah.
So
That sounds right.
but really, it does not take very much to
It
create a
doesn't. If you
fictional
can,
character, and if you can get a group of people believing that character exists.
yes. If you
And
want
then
to
even
make
more
if
so
you want
back
to
then.
forge a person's existence, first thing you have to do, the person can't have a lifespan within the living memory of anyone who's still alive. So you can't have a guy who was born in 1970 and is still around, because people can verify. People can say, I didn't know that guy. I went to that town. I lived there. So it has to be
I think
just
this
outside
was
recent memory.
I think this was the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
Actually, I think
And he
this was
got
early
caught.
1900s. Yeah, and the guy, he made a guy that was still alive, so he wasn't around too long ago. But yeah, what you're talking about is sort of like the cult of Saint Dominic from Soriano. Somebody in 1621 had created a fake story about how this relic had gotten to the church, and conjured up a fake person and a fake story to do all that, and it led to a huge cult following, and this picture got reproduced by, I think, hundreds of times in all sorts of different areas. But yeah, so the removal of it, that's a much easier way to pass off a hoax. You know, if the guy's not alive anymore, you can't just go down the street and ask Johnny whether or not it's true.
A certain amount of time. You also can't make the person too influential.
Right.
Like there's been Wikipedia hoaxes and other hoaxes where, you're making up an entire war between England and the Netherlands. Well, that's going to get found out. That's a big footmark you're leaving. So you have to make them significant enough to show up in history, basically, but not so big that it's like, why haven't I heard of this guy? Why aren't there more documents about this guy? So you have to ride that line and push it back just outside of basically living memory.
I do want to keep going on with these questions, but I do think that, just to wrap up this hoax and forgery topic, the ultimate goal is to make the hoax or the forgery appear as real as possible. And so the best hoaxes and forgeries are the ones that you literally cannot distinguish from the real deal. And so that causes quite an issue. But so yeah, what have you done to combat bad history? I think that's a term.
Oh yeah, so
bad history.
Bad history. Again, I made up the guy in Wikipedia. I share it with the students. My students know now. Don't trust Wikipedia. Go to the sources that are presented on there, and then you can evaluate from there. But again, when I go through stuff with students, a big thing is, what are your sources? What is the source? What is the primary source involved in the thought you're having or the idea you believe in? That's a big part of combating bad history.
Yeah, that's huge.
Another part is I try to do this with my students. Teachers have a tendency to oversimplify things just to get ideas down to the level of a 15-year-old or a 9-year-old.
Right.
To the point where now you're wrong. You can simplify things to the point where you're being incorrect. You've removed too much information, and now you've created bad history that student now remembers. I'll give you an example. Hammurabi. If you go online and you find lesson plans about Hammurabi that are taught to 6th graders, middle school age kids usually, Hammurabi was the guy who wrote the first law code, and everybody else read the law code, said that was great, started making their own law codes. There's no truth to that at all. It's a completely fictional story, because the real story has been simplified to the point that it's no longer true. Hammurabi made a law code, we know that, but other people did too, and other people made law codes long before Hammurabi. He's not the originator of written law codes. What?
Could you name one?
Namu. Namu. He wrote an earlier law code, and there's a handful of other ones. It's just when they discovered Hammurabi's code, which is like around 1910, it was the earliest law code we'd ever found up to that point.
Right.
And so that became not the earliest law code we ever found up to that point, the earliest law code ever.
Yeah, I see how that works.
And now lies are being perpetuated, and we hold up Hammurabi like he had this great idea to codify a law code that everyone can read, and that that whole concept predates him, but he gets ownership of it.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah.
And so I try to not simplify history to the point where I'm actually creating a lie, because then you might as well just not teach it. You might as well just have kids doodle.
Right, yeah. The point of teaching history is to try and get people to know what has happened in the past, and to present that in as most an honest and truthful way as possible.
That's a big struggle. Another big struggle is I have students and I have fellow teachers who want to take what's going on right now to shade the past. They would use that teleological thinking where they're using right now to talk about then.
Like how?
And it's like,
What would
what
be an
happened
example of
then?
that?
What?
What would be an example of that? How does that work?
And this goes into the oversimplification of things. You'll have a lot of people who say like, oh yeah, the Democrats and the Republicans, they kind of switched what they were at some point. You ever hear that one?
I actually have heard that one. Where, today's Democrats or yesterday's Republicans or something like that.
Yeah, which is, again, an oversimplification.
Right.
Because you could see, if you look at, let's say, the Republican Party and the Democrat Party at any given time have 100 different features in them. And if you isolate 5 of them and compare and contrast them across the last century, you could say, yes, they have switched positions in a sense. But you're ignoring all the other things that have nothing to do with anything. So in like 1860, the Democratic Party was pro-slavery. Well, we don't have a pro-slavery party today. So people tend to ignore the vast majority of what the reality of politics were at any given time to make those comparisons that aren't actually there.
So sort of what's being done here is that they're simplifying a group of people so much and they're only focusing on the similarities that it's like the Bart Simpson quote, it's not about the small similarities, it's about the big differences or something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
I actually use a clip from The Simpsons in my class. It's a lesson a lot of people use where Mr. Burns hits Bart with his car. Have you ever seen that episode?
Probably. I've watched all those.
And they're in the court. And, of course, Bart gives a testimony and Mr. Burns gives a testimony. And they're vastly different.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually use this second day of class in a lot of my classes to demonstrate. I say right away, well, you already know what a primary source is. You know what a secondary source is. Which is more reliable? And then we watch the clip, and they write down the primary source, which is Bart's testimony and Mr. Burns' testimony. And then I say, you're going to make a secondary source right now. You guess what really happened. And then we show the clip from the episode of what really happened. And what they find out is, hey, my secondary source was more accurate than these 2 primary sources.
Well, you sound like a great teacher because I do not remember my history teacher going into any of that. I just remember him being as boring as could be and sort of neglectful towards his class, but then again, I wasn't paying attention too much in high school, so what do I know?
I don't know
what we're just
like
talking about.
Yeah.
We can
but
misrepresent.
In New York State, we have a lot of social studies teachers who are actually just like the soccer coach, so they get the history certification so that they can go coach because that's what they're really passionate about, and then they just kind of muddle through the classes. So it's unfortunate, but.
So do you have any, let's talk about your podcast. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, so I run the Other States of America History podcast. I just started it a couple weeks ago, and it focuses on all the history that's not in the New York State curriculum or quickly glanced over. Because I think New York State updated their curriculum like 2-3 years ago. They want to become in sync with Common Core, and they just update it every now and then. And it's become incredibly front-loaded, especially for global studies, but also for U.S. history. Global studies, for example, if you look at the New York State curriculum, it's like, first of all, we don't have a standardized state test for Global 1 anymore. So all of the world history from the Paleolithic era up until the Enlightenment will never be tested on at the state level. They will never have a standardized test on ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the Han Chinese Empire.
Do you know why that is?
They just got rid of it. It was part of it up until like 2 years ago.
They just decided. A committee
I'm
voted
guessing
on
they said
it.
the scope is too large. It's becoming too much about trivia and not enough about actual skill and reading comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
It's gone. So Global 1 is completely untested at the state level. Global 2 now is roughly 1500 to present, and basically it's a race to the 20th century, and half the course is 20th century on. It's very quickly becoming current events class. So it really surprised me. It doesn't treat the times evenly, which I get. All right. So you're going to have some periods of time that you're going to slow down and focus on, and then other parts you're going to zoom through maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's literally like 1500 to 1900. You can get that done in less than half the year, and then you're going to spend half of this year just on the last 100 years or so.
There were kings and queens, and then World War II happened.
Yeah, it's being pushed and pushed and pushed like this. Which I understand. There's only so much time. You can't have 4 years of high school, all dedicated to social studies, every class.
Hmm.
So there are things that fall missing. And in U.S. history, because in New York State, it's U.S. history and government. So it's tied into the structure of how our government works, the history of our government, the Constitution, and all that. Very important stuff. But there are things that I find interesting that fall on the wayside.
So that's where
things
your
like,
podcast comes in.
exactly. Like, you're living in Michigan, New York State, New Jersey, a couple other places around there. We're part of a colony called New Netherland. For like 60 or 45 years, something like that.
Hmm.
I'm not the best with math. But that is a footnote in the time we really have to address that. It's a footnote. It's part of one lesson, maybe. And then we got to move on because we got to get on to things that I know the kids will be tested on.
And even
I don't
today,
wanna-
we have so many Dutch people here. Like I'm in West Michigan, and it's basically just Dutch people.
Yeah. And the same thing in the Albany area. Incredible amount of diversity here. And yet in any given classroom, I say, raise your hand if you know you're part Dutch. And you'll get a quarter of the class raising their hand. And I'll say, does anyone think that's weird that you're Dutch, considering we've never learned anything about the Dutch? Why are you here exactly?
Right.
In Michigan, if you look at the way people migrated across the United States, they tended to stay at the same latitude, and they just moved over in longitude. So all those Dutch people in New York found their way to Michigan. And so, we might be related distantly. Who knows?
I haven't checked out your podcast, but now you've got me interested. So I've been looking for new podcasts to listen to, and I'm going to have to check that one out. Is it,
Yeah, I
where
think
do you post
everybody
it?
has right now. Like, there's just nothing to do, really.
Right, yeah.
I mean, how many times can you watch Tiger King?
There's like a lot of the stuff that I do on my website is sort of like copying and pasting information, just sort of collecting statistics. And so it's not stuff that I have to really be focused on. So I'll put like a podcast on in the background, and I've listened to like every single episode of the 4 or 5 main podcasts that I listen to. So I'm trying to find some more.
What's your favorite podcast?
Right now, the one that's going, it's called Myth Vision Podcast. And funny
Never heard
enough,
of this one.
this is the one that is spearheading the Christ myth theory and trying to figure out whether or not Christ was a real person, like based on a real person, or if it was a collection of myths. And so Derek Lambert, the host, he's awesome. He has people on from both sides to talk about it. And he's had some really big names on his show. He's had Richard Carrier, I think, was on it once. Robert Price, Dr. Robert Price. I don't know if you've heard of him.
That sounds familiar.
He was on it. I'm pretty sure he's had Joseph Atwill on there a couple times. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his theory is that the Romans created Jesus as a sort of a comical joke against the common people, I think it was, or something like that. It's been a while since I looked into his. It's called
I don't know if
Caesar's
the
Messiah.
documentation would support that, but
So yeah,
I'm not going to break it apart.
Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely a lot of stuff to look into. These
well, on
different
that
people.
subject, it seems like I mean, you've probably done more research in this than I have. The last time I really jumped into religion was before I was teaching, because now I got to jump into the stuff I'm teaching. That's what the responsible thing to do.
It's been a few years for you then, looking into some of this stuff. Personally,
Yeah.
I'm skeptical about it, and I have my own reasons that other people
Skeptical
don't.
about which part of it?
Just
Jesus being a historical character, or the
legitimacy of both of them, both sides, but more so skeptical of the base claim that Christ was a real person or based on a real person. I think skepticism is a healthy amount of skepticism is good for generating stronger ideas and beliefs on what has happened. So,
yeah.
But yeah, getting into all that, I'll have to make a separate video to talk about why I think that there might be a possibility that Jesus Christ is not based on a real person. But
there's always a possibility. Yeah, I'd say so.
So
I would say he had more historical credibility than other religious figures like Buddha. If you look at the dating,
I wouldn't be the first to come on camera to say I think Buddha is definitely a real person too. I'm skeptical about whether or not he actually existed as a figure, if he was based on other beliefs that were around at the time. You were talking about comparative mythology and comparative religion and comparative history earlier. Those fields, they're really young. Like,
definitely.
finally being able to compare. I mean, you and I talking from Michigan to New York, this is a really recent phenomenon that we've
This
been
is
able
Star
to.
Trek stuff.
Yeah,
This is
right.
crazy.
Yeah, we're pulling up these images on these cameras, and yeah, it's pretty wild.
I'm so old that when I was a kid, my dad worked at GE. They'd have take your kid to work day. We'd go into this huge conference room, and they would telecommute us to a group of kids in Japan at another GE factory, and our minds were blown because it was Star Trek to us.
Yeah.
And now we don't even think again twice about it. We've become so used to it so quickly.
Right.
This is amazing right now, and I can't appreciate it.
I can appreciate it. I think this is awesome. So, yeah, your podcast sounds really cool. Do you have any other plans or events coming up related to history?
Just teaching my classes. It's hard to do right now because depending on the district you're in, are the schools shut down in Michigan? I'm assuming.
I would imagine, yeah. I think so.
So some schools are not giving out grades, which I know when I was in school, if you said to me when I was 15, okay, you're going to do school on your laptop at home and you're not going to get any grades. So do it, don't do it. You're going to make it to next year. That's how a lot of schools are around here. So I'm finding it challenging to just find things that aren't too long because the kid's not going to do it,
Mm-hmm.
and that will be interesting to them, that they'll actually want to do it. And then the third piece, where it's actually relevant to the curriculum that I have to teach. So I'm just in this bubble.
Here's another question that I was interested about. How long do class times run in New York schools for high school?
It depends on the school. When I subbed, I worked in districts when I was a sub where they had 4 hour-and-a-half blocks a day, which is horrendous.
Yeah, right.
Because our attention span's not that great. The kids younger than us, an hour and a half? That's insane for a 15-year-old, 14-year-old to have to be committed to.
Mm-hmm.
So, at smaller schools where they can't really do block rotations, they can't move around classes because they don't have the numbers,
Mm-hmm.
then you'll get the usual 45-minute class, 42-minute class, things like that. So I've seen anywhere from 42 minutes to an hour and a half. It depends on the district. We have a lot of freedom in New York State as how to organize that. So
Yeah. Yeah, I've also found it really interesting just how much it varies across different states and different schools and stuff. Like, sort of, I think coming up, I had this idea that all the schools were sort of, following the same exact curriculum. We're all getting taught the same stuff and same class types.
People always dump on public American school, the American school system, but there's some great things about it. Education is a state right. That's why you have the Michigan public school system, the New York State public school system.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we have a Department of Education now, which only really came around in like 1981. So your grandparents, I don't know what your opinion of them are, but they grew up before the Department of Education even existed.
Yeah, I love my grandparents.
Yeah, so and you probably consider them pretty smart, and they grew up without a Department of Education. So one good thing about our education system is that it's so decentralized, or at least it used to be. It's diffuse, and that's slowly going away. So that's why my podcast likes to focus on these little pockets of things that existed in specific areas. Like New Sweden, it existed, little south of here, modern-day Delaware, around that area. It's not really part of American history in New York State.
I don't think it's American history, but have you ever heard of New Schwabenland?
It was a German colony in South America or Antarctica?
Antarctica, I think. It was, it's a pretty central key component for some of these conspiracy theories about Hitler faking his suicide. And
aren't they great? I love conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it definitely, it's a great
them.
Showcase of creativity to see what people can come up with. Because it definitely takes creativity to come up with a conspiracy theory.
You'll never see a conspiracy theory that's not interesting.
Right.
That's why they catch on so well.
Occasionally there are conspiracy theories that are real. I think it'd be irresponsible to say that nobody has ever conspired against somebody.
Oh, yeah, there's conspiracy all the time.
So, yeah, it's interesting.
The one example I hear a lot from different people is Watergate. Look at that conspiracy. Yeah. It was a conspiracy of like 5 guys, and look how quickly that fell apart.
Right, yeah.
So, when they say the moon landing is fake, you would need, 150,000 people to be hush-hush about that. All the way up to this point,
yeah,
I don't know.
It'd be interesting if someone were to really go in at a critical approach and come up with some numbers as to like how many people would actually have to be in on this just to get it out, like to have the final word on it.
Yep.
We would
And
need exactly 1,400 people to keep the secret, but I don't think anyone's actually done that. So.
Oh, and that applies to you talking about the historiosity. I can't even
Historicity?
think of the word. The thing is, I teach kids, and so my vernacular goes down to their level.
I think it's
And so-
historicity of Christ is
Yes,
the term
that's
you're
the word
looking
I'm
for.
looking for.
Yeah.
How many people would be required to make up that person? What would be that critical number? Especially considering some of the letters of Paul date to within, 15 years of when Jesus would have been crucified. There's still, most people around would have been around then. How many people do you need to be in on this lie or this myth or this delusion? How many people have to fall under this delusion in order for it to seal itself up nicely? I don't know what that number is, but in the case of Jesus, I would hazard to say it's too big to pull it off.
Right. Yeah. That would also it'd be interesting to get some statistics on that as well.
But again, yeah, I'm just saying this from an outsider's point of view. It just seems like it'd be too many people. There's just so many people around from the time Jesus would have been alive. And they could have very easily have said, I don't know this guy. This guy didn't exist. I don't remember this happening. One guy, Celsus. Have you ever read the Arguments of Celsus?
Yeah, I think I even have an article on him on my website.
I found a book he did. I think Oregon or another scholar broke down all the arguments Celsus made on why Christianity was BS, basically. And one thing Celsus never brought up was the simple fact that maybe Christ maybe just never existed to begin with. And so
Second
we find
century, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
And so,
I have I think I have an article up on Celsius.
I just call him Celsus because the I's missing, right?
Right, yeah, Celsus. Well, yeah, I think that's the guy's name, but there's another guy that he's an ancient Greek historian who has a similar name. Now I got to find that out.
Yeah, the Greek names you can pronounce them 100 different ways and you're still going to be wrong. Like Herodotus, some people say Herodotus, some people say Herodotus.
Right, yeah.
And yet if you hear a Greek person say it, you'd go, "What?" The emphasis is all different than how we would say it in English.
Yeah, I don't know who I was thinking of, but yeah, Celsus is a popular person.
And it's a great book. If you read his arguments, you go like, wow, these are really good criticisms that cut right to the weaknesses in the Gospels and whatnot. But he never brings up the fact that, hey, maybe he just didn't exist.
Off the top of your head? Oh,
what?
Sorry. No, continue. Sorry.
The same thing with, have you ever read the Todoth Yeshua, I believe it's called?
The what?
Todelf Yeshua. It's a document written by...
I can't say I have.
Yeah, it's kind of a parody on the Gospels that was written...
oh, maybe I have. That sounds familiar.
In the Jewish community, and the dating is off, and I know how you are with dates, and I'm the same on this document. Who knows when the exact dating was on it? But it does a similar thing. It presents the Gospels from the point of view of maybe a Jewish critic who would have been around at the time. And again, they never just say, he just didn't exist. This is all made up.
Yeah, no, I've heard that argument. The first people that really start to believe in the Christ myth idea was like 17 or 1800s, that serious ideas were coming up on the idea that he might not have actually existed. Until then, nobody had ever questioned it.
You get these people studying Oriental cultures for the first time, at the time meaning anything from Turkey on. Mm-hmm. And they just discovered these common myths. They discover the cuneiform and they discover another flood myth. They discover these myths and that myth and whatnot. And now we know today, there was a common Middle Eastern set of mythologies. And it wasn't like somebody secretly stole all these myths and put it together and created a Bible. The Bible existed inside of this world where everyone kind of had a version of these stories. It's not it's not a plagiarism issue. It's everybody had that story. It's folklore. It's common. Mm-hmm. Of course, 120 years ago, you had just the Bible, and then we discovered all this stuff, and we went, wait a minute, it's all plagiarized. And then we started to get more context and realize, oh, there's a world that these people lived in, and the Bible was part of that world, or the stories that went into the Bible. And so we're not seeing, it's kind of like with Hammurabi, where they thought, oh, Hammurabi has the code. And then they discovered all these older codes. Well, we had the Bible, and then they discovered these older stories that went into the very first parts of the Bible. We're talking about less than 10% of it. And then you realize once you get enough of this stuff, oh, this all just existed in the same swirling cultural osmosis, you know. So it's a lot to tackle.
Yeah,
But
I think it was David Lowenthal, pretty famous historian, who said that
yeah.
it takes like a just what is it? Dedicate. It really takes dedication to fathom history. Like it takes sustained effort,
Oh,
I think is what it is.
like I said, you will lose. You'll just go crazy. I'm going crazy right now trying to think of it. If you really try to actualize any given time, even a small community, you could study a community in Michigan 120 years ago, and once you start taking it all in and you try to picture it, try to get a bird's eye view of what was going on, you'll go insane because the human brain is not supposed to process something from that point of view.
Right.
So yeah, history can be utterly devastating to your mental health.
So yeah, we're nearing the end of our episode here. Just one last thing that I'm gonna give to everybody on this series is a chance to leave a message for people, especially the youth, who want to pursue a hobby or are pursuing a hobby or a career in historical fields. So, what is your message to the people?
Pursuing history.
Yeah, for anybody that's even interested in the slightest, that you just want to know like where your family came from or where did your city come from, even at a hobby level or career level. What would your message be to those people who are interested in expanding their knowledge base more?
I would say two or three things. First of all, sources. It's all about sources. Go back to the sources, look at the dates, consider the reliability, the point of view. That's really essential because we live in a day and age where things can be made up. I've made up things. I show them off to my students. I'm going to have the record hopefully someday. We'll see. And so sources is the number one thing. The second thing is you have to abandon all forms of tribalism if you really want to get inside of something. So a lot of people, they'll start pursuing a subject in history and they'll have an agenda. You got to put that agenda aside, all right? Treat it a little bit like a scientific experiment where you have a control group and then you have the group you do the experiment on, and you're just going to go straight forward with it. You might have a hypothesis, but don't have the theory yet. Theory comes after experimentation. You might have a guess, and you have to be willing to accept that you were wrong about that. So I see a lot of people go into history, and they'll just keep looking at things that reaffirm what they thought to begin with, which is like you might as well just sit on the couch because you already had your thought in your head. Consider you might be wrong. Abandon all tribalism. Whatever point of view you have or identity you have, jump into somebody else's shoes. There's no reason for me to put my modern self into something that I'm reading from 400 years ago. My point of view about that is almost irrelevant if I want to consider how they were thinking about their subject.
Are you
That would
trying
be
to
the
say that the ancient Egyptians didn't have cheese in a can?
I don't believe they did.
I don't
I
know.
don't.
Maybe.
Maybe a ceramic can. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a great message. And just one more experience for myself before we close. There's a controversial idea that there are pictures of pineapples at Pompeii and
Okay.
Herculaneum. And the reason that this is an issue is because allegedly Christopher Columbus was the first person to bring pineapples back to Europe after his journey to America. And Pompeii and Herculaneum were covered by Vesuvius in 79 AD and weren't rediscovered until the 18th or 19th century.
Sounds right.
And so it would be an anachronistic picture to have a pineapple at one of these cities. And so I was somewhat convinced that this image from Pompeii actually did depict a pineapple. And I went in and did a bunch of research to try and see if it was a decent idea or not. I compared other pictures from Pompeii that had the idea is that it's a pine cone and that it just kind of looks like a pineapple. And
Yes, from your modern eyes, yeah, you would go
right.
pineapple.
And so I thought it was a pineapple, and even after I had done the comparison of the other pictures, I thought it was still a pineapple and that there was something there to be explained. But now, currently, I will admit that I do think it is a pine cone for this reason alone that nobody else has ever shared before, and I haven't seen this anywhere else, and I don't even think I've put this in a video
I'm getting the
anywhere
scoop.
else.
I'm ready.
But in my comparison, one thing that I overlooked prior to posting my belief that it was a pineapple is that there is another pine cone I think it's a pine cone now, so I'm going to call it a pine cone in the picture. But there's another pine cone just behind the one that looks like a pineapple, and it's shaded a shade darker. And in a lot of the other mosaics and paintings of pine cones from Pompeii, they do that. They show one of the pine cones a lighter shade and the other pine cone a darker shade. And so even though it looks weird and the artist kind of sucked from our modern day perspective to the point that he couldn't depict a pine cone without a reasonable doubt, that kind of looks like a pineapple. He didn't know what he was doing, but I think
draw a pineapple. Let's see you do it.
So yeah, I mean, I think I'm a decent artist. I could draw a pineapple and a pine cone, and you could tell the difference. But the main thing was that it based on the color of the two items in the fruit bowl. I think that it is a pine cone, and this is just an example of one thing. You know, if you were to reject that claim that the shading doesn't matter, then you could still try and convince yourself it's a pineapple. And there are two other things from Herculaneum that I'm still curious about to try and figure out more to see what sort of explanations could be given. But they're sort of blurry images, but they really do sort of look like pineapples. And supposedly Herculaneum was the richest of the cities that got destroyed by Vesuvius, and so it would make sense that that city would be the one to have depictions of pineapples because they were the wealthiest and pineapples were a sign of wealth. But it's still to be determined, and other people who are interested in the Pompeian and Herculaneum pineapples, you could definitely find more information out on the web about that to contribute to the discussion.
Yeah, I've seen about that. I've seen a lot on people looking at ancient Egyptian art and seeing like flashlights. Have you seen people talking about that?
The Baghdad Battery and stuff like that, yeah.
Baghdad Battery, yeah. And in the ancient Egyptian case, it's probably a lotus flower. And if you know the context of the time and the mythology surrounding lotus flowers, the art makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But if you're a modern person just projecting your what you expect back onto the art, you go, that's a flashlight.
That's a
helicopter.
If you look
closer, it's got petals. You know, it's a flower.
I think the famous one is the helicopter. What? I think the famous one is the helicopter.
The helicopter.
It shows a helicopter, and it's supposedly two different writings superimposed over each other that just makes it happen to look like a helicopter. So, yeah, it's a coincidence that it looks like that, and that
happens all the time.
Yeah,
I think there's a name for it. It's Pareidolia, I think is the name of it. It's the reason why you look at clouds and you see dogs and stars and cars. You know.
Pareidolia, maybe. I thought that was just for faces, but maybe it is for everything.
It's just the habit of human beings to look for patterns and things. Look for things you recognize.
Pareidolia is a type of
there it is.
Apophenia, which is a more generalized term for seeing patterns in random data. So yeah, you're right. It is seeing patterns where there's really just randomness.
Or it's meaningful in a different culture, but to you it's random. Like I've argued with people who believe in like rock giants, who believe mountains are sleeping giants.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And they'll go like, look, there's the nose, and I'll say to them, well, you're looking at the pieces that confirm what you're thinking. Mm-hmm. What about this outcropping right here that would just be like a tumor growing out of the side of his head?
He had a big tumor.
You're looking at
people have tumors. I'm just kidding. I don't think they're giants, but they could be. Who knows? I don't think they are, but maybe they're onto something there.
But people look for patterns. It's a healthy thing. It keeps us alive. You know, if in nature, you gotta be aware of things like that.
Yeah, and I just finished reading an article about deception in nature, and it goes in and talks about all these different animals that have these built-in deceptive qualities to them. You know, like caterpillars that look like snakes and owls that look like trees and stuff like that. It's the pattern recognition. It's really important for survival. So
yeah, and sometimes it trips you up. So, you know, if you expect a modern person with no background in history or archaeology to correctly interpret something carved into stone 4,000 years ago before they mastered 3D perspective, you know, it's going to be a mixed bag. And it's no fault of their own. It's just they don't live in that time. It's fine. It's okay to be wrong.
Right, yeah, it's definitely okay to be wrong, and I think everybody that's ever lived has probably been wrong about something at some point or another in their life, so definitely it's okay. You don't want to beat yourself up too much about it.
So I can attest to that.
Well, she's always right, so you don't want to get into that argument with her.
This is the look I got right now. her mug. It says "Mrs. Always Right." Yeah. It's odd how that worked out.
That is hilarious. I think that's
Love that.
a good spot to close. So,
Okay.
Thanks for joining me, Eric. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Steve.
I enjoyed
Yeah,
talking
it's been
with
fun
you.
to talk to someone other than kids.
Yeah, right. Cool. Until next time, take care.
All right.